Thanks for tuning into Power Athlete Radio. Dr. Peter Ballerstedt is a forage agronomist. Working in ruminant agriculture, that means predominantly meat and milk, Peter has research and resources at his fingertips, making him an expert in controversial subjects such as the consumption of grain-fed versus grass-fed beef. With the dawn of popular nutritional protocols like paleo, a whirlwind of emphasis has been put on choosing organic, free-range, grass-fed, pain-free, hugged twice daily meat. Power Athlete has always maintained that you are what you eat eats. However, in speaking with Peter, it's clear that there are far more machines at work driving people to choose grass-fed over grain-fed, and shocker, not all of them have your performance as their top priority. John has never shied away from uncovering new information in the name of battling the bullshit, and today's episode is certainly no exception. This conversation had us all scratching our heads and furiously doing our own research on the subject of grain-fed versus grass-fed. Today, we start a beef with the meat industry. This is episode 152.
Power Athlete Nation, what is up? As is tradition, you have John and Luke here out of Orange County with Tex in Texas. We're going to jump right into this because we've been battling some tech issues on our end that have been a pain in the ass. But we have Peter Ballerstedt on, who is a forage agronomist. And basically, I'll let John jump into how we decided to call Peter in. But Peter, before we get into there, because this was a relatively new job role that, to me, why don't you go ahead and give us kind of the nuts and bolts behind what the heck forage agronomist is?
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for the invitation. Simply stated, forages are those plants that are grown to be eaten by animals, and agronomy are the sciences of soil and plant and field management. So I work in agriculture. I primarily support ruminate agriculture, so that's the production ultimately of meat and milk. I'm also keenly interested in the paleo, primal, low-carb nutrition messages, so it's a happy coincidence.
Yeah, and one thing you had mentioned before the show is like you're kind of stuck between this rock and a hard place, right? In the sense that, you know, you're a fan of this kind of low-carb paleo and food quality type deal, and the people who are passionate about that, you certainly sympathize with them. But then you're, on the other hand, you know, the majority of your work goes towards agriculture, which a lot of times that big ag tends to be vilified in those circles that, you know, on both ends, right?
Indeed. I think that I find myself wanting to introduce a lot of the people that I've known for many years in agriculture who desperately need to hear the nutrition and health message personally, as well as just to kind of make them feel better about the industries they're involved with. And then at the same time, the people that I've learned so much from about nutrition and health will frequently say things that I know to be factually incorrect. And if you've ever read a book and found yourself reading a book where, you know, they say something ridiculous and the book seeming almost jumps out of my hands, it's very hard for me to keep reading, which is bad behavior on my part, because I should continue and see where they're right, as well as, you know, twitch hard when I find where they're wrong. So I just want to make sure, because I think the dietary and health message is so important. I want to make sure that we don't pick up any misinformation along the way, that then, you know, I don't know what a good analogy for you would be, but if you're listening to somebody on something completely new, and then they go ahead and they drop something into the conversation about fitness or exercise or strength, you know, conditioning, whatever, that you know to not be true, it's going to make it very hard for you to listen to that bit that you don't know about. At least from my perspective, it's, well, I know they're wrong about this, so how does that color the other information that they're trying to deliver. And I also find it somewhat ironic that we can, fly off to these big conferences or what have you, and then criticize the producers of food that make it possible for us to have the kind of disposable income that then allows us to go fly off to these conferences. So.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. I mean, we run into this all the time where somebody's trying to put something out and then they just completely, side with something that's complete bullshit, and then instantly it just taints all the message. And then at that point, you're kind of like, well, if I'm supposed to be learning something here and you make a completely, erroneous claim that we know to be not true, what else is not true? And so it kind of destroys the ethos of it. And really, what we were talking about offline is the message for Power Athlete is really the battle of the bullshit. And part of this is not only strength conditioning, but nutrition, food, and really just having different people like yourself come on and just, really give us kind of key information. It just seems that there's so much misinformation out there about, food quality and this, and, and it gives people the excuse to charge, $50 a pound for a grass-fed versus, $4 or $5 a pound versus a grain-fed, and they almost stigmatize it so much.
Exactly. So there's a lot there. The simplest way to start this is that so many of these issues or causes are now all conflated and twisted together, and so you kind of have to be really careful and tease them apart to know exactly what is it we're talking about, on both sides of the conversation. So from just a food quality, a nutritional background issue, when I got started in 2007 with a low carbohydrate, basically I was following Mike Ead's Protein Power. That's how I got started. I was a pre-diabetic, balding, obese, whatever I was then. I'm now going to be 60 in August. So, and today I'm just balding. So, it's not a miracle, right? Being a forage agronomist by training, I was reading all these people saying things about grass-fed meat, and of course I loved that message, right? It just tripped all my biases, frankly. And what I did was I started looking at the actual studies. And what I found was a lot of these studies were coming out of the mindset that said, well, we know that fat in the diet causes heart disease, right? And so they kind of are based on that faulty premise. So very early on, the proponents of grass-fed meat were talking about how it's lower in saturated fat than grain-finished meat. Well, what if saturated fat isn't an issue? There was even talk about differences in cholesterol levels, and dietary cholesterol has never been an issue, et cetera, et cetera. So I started digging in a little deeper, and it all seems to go back to what I call the Greenland paradox, that these researchers found that communities in Greenland ate very high levels. Well, the quote from the paper went something like, the Greenland Eskimos have, or however they describe them, have very low rates of heart disease despite eating a diet high in fat. And there you have it. So they then said it must be the fish oil, et cetera, et cetera. So all of this then becomes very questionable in my mind, and then you find the actual data that shows what the difference between grass-finished versus grain-finished beef is. And if someone wants to be eating grass-finished beef because they think that that's what they need, that's fine. You're going to pay more for it, and if you can afford it, that's great. But if that's your reason for choosing it, then you shouldn't be eating pork and you shouldn't be eating poultry. And please don't let me find you eating vegetable oils. because you're not going to get any benefit from the beef, and that extra money that you're spending isn't being well invested. How to put it?
Peter, not to cut you off, but that's kind of an interesting statement about pork and chicken. Not that, I don't want to really get off the beef, but, why would, is that because those are just so commercially raised and, I guess just really not a healthy alternative? For so long it was like, oh, don't eat meat, it's got saturated fat, eat chicken, and people love to vilify the pork, but
the other white meat.
Yeah, the other white meat.
Right, the other dry, tasteless white meat. And I don't have anything to say about pork or poultry. I'm just not involved. I'm a ruminant advocate. But the reason is because fundamentally these animals are very different and their digestive systems are very different. And so a ruminant, the meat of a ruminant animal will always have a lower level of polyunsaturated fatty acids than will meat from poultry or swine, just because of the biological architecture. Now, I'm not saying we need to worry about pork and poultry. I'm just saying for consistency's sake. Another way to put it is that beef, and this would be lamb or goat or any other ruminant animal, is not a rich source of either omega-6 or omega-3.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So sorry to cut you off.
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah. So we're at the Greenland paradox. Obviously, if you have the money to eat grass-fed, but if you really don't, it's kind of negligible in terms of these amounts. So, what would be the argument for, let's say, is it sustainability? Is it a healthier practice? Is the animal? What about the differences? Just nutritionally are there really differences? Because if you get online, it's 3 million responses within 3 seconds of the reason why grass-fed is so much more healthier for you than grain-fed.
Right. So I think mostly it's about perception, and as I said, there are many issues that then all get wrapped up into one. So people make statements about E. coli that aren't justified. They make statements about antibiotics. They make statements about exogenous hormones, and all of those can be refuted, but typically it's very hard to have that kind of conversation. So if somebody is, for example, these are just some, I'm looking at some slides now, so forgive me because I can't remember this stuff, but if you're going to try to get omega-3 from grass-fed beef, in order to get the amount of omega-3 that you could get from 1 ounce of cooked wild-caught Atlantic salmon, you'd have to eat 48 ounces, 3 pounds, of cooked.
That sounds like a challenge.
Cooked, grass-fed ground beef. And the problem with that is you're going to be eating more omega-6 than you are, just a little bit. It's really, really, beef is not the source, regardless of how it's produced. But for example, if you're still eating safflower oil, you'd have to eat 32 ounces of salmon to counteract the omega-6 you'd get from 2 tablespoons of that oil. So if you're eating vegetable oils, grass-fed is an irrelevancy. It can't make a difference just from the numbers. Now, if you want to look at other things like sustainability, I think that there's arguments to be made there as well. But again, if you know producers in your local area and you can purchase grass-fed meat from those, and those farmers, that's great. That's wonderful. Go ahead and do that. But again, many of the arguments that are made in favor of that really don't stand scrutiny. In fact, depending on how you want to shape the models, there are some suggestions that some work has shown that grass-fed meat actually will result in greater greenhouse gas production than grain-finished meat. So, and you can argue all of these things. It's just not as settled as many people make it sound when they advocate for the position one way or the other.
Would there be? I mean, I guess you could say if we did a nutritional analysis, would grass-fed meat have more grams per protein per ounce than, let's say, like grain-fed meat? I mean, I know that's ridiculous bullshit, but like, I'm kind of just searching for, like, given the opportunity, because I mean, really it goes back to if you're eating some form of animal-based protein, like something like, whether it be, lamb or beef, that's the single most important thing. And then I guess, just I'm wondering from the nutritional analysis, with the protein content be higher, I mean, obviously the fatty acid profile is kind of negligible. What about, vitamin A, vitamin K, or just pretty much any type of minerals and vitamins associated with, would the contents be higher? Would they be less?
Well, we can see there's a number of studies that will cite quantitative differences in a number of constituents. So differences in vitamin A or vitamin K. Specifically, if you end up with a leaner cut of whatever animal it is, compared to one that has more fat, you're going to have, therefore, more protein in the leaner cut because you're getting less fat. So you can see that. Part of the problem then is we have very little way to talk intelligently about the biological significance of the quantitative differences, right? So some work that I've certainly read that suggests, your need for vitamins, for example, is heavily impacted by how much carbohydrate you're eating. So how important is it that you have those kinds of vitamin differences, for example? Is that really the critical thing? And I don't think we have a good answer for it. I think that the antioxidant questions that come up are, again, heavily prejudiced by the whole general what is a healthy diet conversation that we've been having for the last 4 decades in this country. So we shouldn't get confused between what's measurable differences and biologically significant differences. And if we're dealing with people who are economically challenged in terms of what they're already buying at the store, I think that we have to be very circumspect about telling them that they have to spend even more than it's going to require for them to shift away from what some people call the garbage to one that's heavier on animal products, eggs, dairy, meat.
You made a great statement that I still remember, 3.5 years later, about the problem not necessarily being the grain-fed meat, it was more the grain-fed people. And I remember, the first thing you talked, you made that comment, and I was like, I actually wrote it down and was like, wow, that's a pretty amazing statement. I mean, you're having people that are so wrapped up in this idea of grass-fed versus grain-fed, and it's probably not that as much as it is like you said, the vegetable oils and the different grains that the individual's consuming. I mean, ruminates have, multiple stomachs that they're able to process and, chew grass and being able to do it, whereas, humans having one stomach, maybe not as, able to process these things as well.
Absolutely. To the point of sustainability as well, what we have is the vast majority of the land surface of the world can't produce feedstuffs that humans can utilize directly. And even on that land that can produce human utilizable feedstuffs, the entire crop isn't utilizable. There's byproduct, or there's straw, or there's all kinds of material that's produced that we as monogastrics can't utilize. But ruminants can take that high fiber, low fat feedstuff and convert it into high quality animal fat. And then through the rumen microbes, they can take non-protein nitrogen and convert it into high quality animal protein, which the world seems to have a problem supplying. So as we look at a growing world population, ruminant animals are going to be critical to meeting the goal of, I think the UN figures or something like doubling the food production of today by 2050, and that would include 60% more animal products, because as the rest of the world becomes more prosperous, they want animal products. So ruminant animals are going to are already a critical part of the world's food supply, and their importance will only increase going forward. I heard Dr. Mike Eads make the statement here last month, maybe February, that we didn't evolve to eat meat. We evolved because we ate meat. And if you look at the ancient cave paintings in Europe, France, for example, it's not of the sacred soybean. It's of the ancient cattle.
Doc, not to take you off on this, but I'm glad I'm not the only one that thinks the consuming of soy and this whole soy debate thing. I mean, like, we get hit with it constantly is probably one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard. And I battle with people all the time. They're like, no, soy is an adequate style of protein. I'm like, dude, it is not. So I'm glad I'm not the only one that gets a kick out of that stuff.
Good. No, somewhere it's interesting to see how all of the narratives had to be shifted to align to what was now going to be the story of the heart healthy diet. So leading up into the 60s, the people that had actually done obesity research on real live human beings knew what it was that made people get fat. The science was advancing to allow them to explain all the mechanisms. And it was understood, in fact, prior to, you have the old information pre-anti-seizure medication, how to deal with childhood epilepsy, and then you had the anti-seizure meds come along and they forgot all the previous information. You had the diabetes diet prior to having insulin available, and that was going to be a restricted carbohydrate diet, and that's how they treated people until they had exogenous insulin that they could administer, and so they forgot all the stuff that came before. And now you had this, we know that fat in the diet causes heart disease, and so all the information about how to prevent or reverse obesity through a restricted carbohydrate diet got just completely forgotten because, since we know that fat in the diet causes heart disease, then we have to come up with a different explanation for obesity. And you can see that thing rippling out in all kinds of other topics. And one of them was, it is still common knowledge amongst anyone that actually does work that plant protein and animal protein are in no way equivalent. And that if you're going to try to be a vegetarian diet, you have to consume more protein in order to get enough. And somewhere along the line, I came across a figure of like 30% more. And yet, that's a problem, right? Because we're going to tell people to eat less animal products to be heart healthy. And so this contamination spreads throughout all these other disciplines. And again, back to the introduction, I'm hoping that we can avoid some of that in our new expanding and developing understanding. But it's not at all debatable that animal protein is superior to plant protein. And yet, we're still having the conversation. People will rail against processed food, and I say, excuse me, are we talking about processed plant products or processed animal products? These are two very different things. And yet they all get lumped together and they all get vilified. And I would make
like what would be like an example of like Triscuits versus yogurt?
Well, yeah, good. Sure, good point. I was thinking more along the lines of Triscuits versus bacon, or liverwurst, or some other lunch meat, ham or what have you. Partly we've been told that salt is bad for you, and now they're having to walk back from that. They used to be crazy about nitrate, and they're having to come back off that. Yeah. So and then go ahead,
Doc. I was at years ago. I did a speaking engagement with Dr. Cordain, the guy who kind of first theorized and talked about the paleo diet, and part of his whole presentation was talking about how there was no salt in the modern or the hunter-gatherer, paleo man diet. And I remember thinking that, blood was a, primary component of, the Maasai warrior. I mean, I'm sure blood was a component in other ways. And, they're obviously being salt. And then I remember seeing pictures of like massive salt mines and then talking about, the practice of converting salt from the ocean. And I always thought that was kind of a far-reaching claim to assume that, that salt wasn't included, where, if you look at Genghis Khan and their, just his horde, part of their deal is they would slaughter an animal and they would, slab it out, throw it on the back of the horse, cover it with a blanket and ride, and the salt off the animals would cure the meat. So,
yeah. Didn't they pay the Roman soldiers in salt? Yeah. I seem to recall that from somewhere. So yeah, you hear many things, and I think in the fullness of time we'll find out that these arguments just don't stand. In fact, there are alternative hypotheses to explain what it was they were trying to explain through their theory that too much salt led to hypertension and other problems. And
was the idea that if you consume a whole bunch of foods that could be high in salt, like it, I remember seeing the study that the countries in the world where people consume the most nitrates have the most brain cancer. That was a study, and whether or not it was from the nitrates, it also turned out it was most developing countries. So it's like, well, is it most developing countries are consuming things with nitrates? But then what other factors that would be contributing to brain cancer? Would it be everything from air pollution, cell phone?
Yeah.
So the problem becomes is, recently, this is just kind of a little off topic. We were approached about some genetic testing, and this, there's a different company called Fitness Genes, and what they're doing is taking saliva and they're testing different markers for athleticism. And people are getting it done, and then they're kind of shooting it over, and they're like, well, I have this gene. And I was trying to remind people, I'm like, well, one-to-one analysis of saying because I have this gene I'm this way doesn't make sense. It's actually a kind of a massive, combination lock. It's like listening to a symphony of a lot of different notes and keys put together to make music that really kind of gives your genetic profile. And then 50% is only what you start with, and the rest of it is, what you're exposed to in terms of, how you, manifest the genetics based on diet, training, sleep, age, environment, all these other key factors. So you can't look at it one-to-one. And the problem becomes, with a lot of the nutrition is everybody wants to look for a one-to-one cost. So it's like, the countries that eat the most nitrates have brain cancer. It must be the nitrates. And we know that's just not the case.
Right. It's easier. It's just an easier statement to make.
Yeah, because you know what it is. It's clickbait. It causes fear, and then it offers.
Then you can offer a value proposition, which happens to be your solution that you profit off.
Yes.
Right,
so
right. And by the way, it confirms what I went into the study with. So that's all good too. Right?
Well, I think the bigger thing is not what kind of animal-based protein you're eating, it's whether or not you're eating enough animal-based protein.
I would agree. And if we look back through human history, it's been a very, very, very long time, if ever, that the average human, certainly in the developed West, but one might be able to say throughout the world, again, you can find exceptions and incredible poverty, and we should be working to alleviate that. But we spend so little of our daily existence procuring that animal product, right? We're not, and that's a great thing because it frees us up to do other creative things. And so society as a whole can benefit because we have people who are freed from the having to spend 14 hours a day working in their garden or preserving their food or whatever it is. We have this romantic notion of what life used to be like. And the reality... I'm sorry, what?
Like I was joking, that seems like the basis of the Republican Party. Let's talk about how it used to be and what we can get back to. I mean, it's like, but yeah, I mean, isn't that the kind of the romanticizing of like how things used to be? And, I always joke that, dude, all you got to do is, if you want to know how things used to be is, go talk to your grandmother, or somebody that was around the turn of the century, or even, my dad who was a child of the Depression, talking to him about, that life and how things were, and like, standing in line for, just at the supermarket and, like that type of, stuff. He's like, dude, let me tell you, like the romanticizing about this stuff is kind of a ploy by a lot of people that are trying to sell some stuff. So
I think so. My mother had my older brother and myself, and she had us when she was quite old, and that's in 1956. I think she was 43, yes, when I was born. So at that time, that was really,
anything over 26, I believe, it was in, like, I just remember seeing this, that I remember up until about 20 years ago, anything over the age of like 26 was considered a geriatric pregnancy. And they had to go back and constantly redo the medical things because, we live here in Newport Beach where, 45-year-old women are paying $100,000 to, have an egg implant. I mean, I drop my kids off at school, and I'm always surprised when the, moms come in with their kids or the dads, and I'm like, are these just the grandparents?
Well, in some cases they may well be, right? But there's that trend too. But, so my mother was an only child. My father was an only child. And so that puts it back many generations, many years before I could hope to find cousins, right? And so looking for any of those, I remember coming across one family just in census and other records. And here this family is, and it's got, 13 kids, a large family. And I got all excited. And I managed to go back to Reading, Pennsylvania, where all these people are from, and I'm in the municipal graveyard, and I found the family plot, and I'm all excited because now I can find maybe some information. And I remember the shock of standing there in this plot where there's like 9 very small headstone markers, and they were all within 9 months, the date of death.
Oh, geez. Wow.
So this family had been wiped out by something that had come into the community. that was their reality. We don't deal with that. So people want to say, we want this to be changed in our society, but it's like, well, what else are you willing to accept with that? Because it doesn't come alone.
Yeah, my dad tells us stories about, he grew up in Kansas, and, he was, born in 1937, and he remembers when World War II started. They, all of a sudden, World War II hits and the war effort started, and my grandfather was an engineer, and all of his brothers and everybody were engineers, and they were living in Topeka, Kansas, and they all packed up the car. And my dad remembers a little kid, literally they packed up everything in the house, and they were driving out to California for the war effort, because they were literally put out this thing, like, if you were an engineer or you have we have to, for the war effort, and they looked at it as their civic responsibility to go to California to build airplanes and ships, and that's what my grandfather and all of his brothers did, was build aircraft for the McDonnell Douglas plant here in California, and that's how we got out here. But
interesting. My wife.
My dad literally telling the story about riding in the car and them stopping at different places, and they had to they would stop and then they would have to walk for gas, and then there'd be a house and you'd have to knock on the door. There was no gas stations, there was no restaurants, there was nothing, and you had to pack all of the stuff in the car, like tires, everything, and then you're out there trying to fix it. And now what do? We go to the airport and we complain because it's 5 minutes late. We get there, you call an Uber. It's
We've got a PK stand-up bit about that, where the lady's like, the internet's down, I can't handle this. And he's like, you're on an airplane, lady, that takes us across the country in 4 hours when it used to take 4 years.
Well, the other one is, and you'll appreciate this statement, is when I retired from the NFL, I got into this, and I actually had a gym here in Newport Beach, and I opened a gym, and I thought it'd be great. We'll work out, we'll have people, and I had clients. And the thing is that the more technology increased, the less time people had. And I remember this client who came in, and he had a business, he had a personal assistant, he had a chauffeur, he had a cell phone, an iPad, all of these things. And the one thing he didn't have was time. He didn't have time for anything. I don't have time for this. I don't have time to cook my own meals. I don't have time for anything. And I finally asked him, what do you have time for? You have all the technological advances, all of the gadgetry, everything in the world to make your life easier. And it seems like the more shit you get, the less time you have. I'm like, what do you have time for? And I remember he was like, and I never saw him again because he didn't have time for it. And I just remember thinking, all of this, and that's something we've run into constantly with people, I don't have time for this. I'm like, what do you have time for? Because you sure as hell don't have time to source your own food. Can you imagine if you went to the supermarket and there was nothing and you had to survive off of what was in your garden and what you were raising? Or, to go out, at the end of last year, I pulled an elk tag and went out and hunted an elk, and brought it home, and we've been eating that. But I'm like, part of our deal is I want to be able to go out and actually kill and bring something home and feed the kids, and talk to them a little bit about where this stuff comes from. That meat just doesn't come wrapped in cellophane at the store. That there's some process in terms of bringing it in, and it's pretty interesting. And you make a great point about everybody wants to hark back to these easier days when they realistically have no concept of what those harder days were.
Yeah, I heard someone at one of the ag meetings I attended say that more Americans have direct personal experience with the criminal justice system than have direct personal experience with production agriculture. And I said, ooh, let me go look.
I started, in 2009, I started a food company, and the food company was based off this idea that we were traveling so much for work that I was having trouble, because every time you go into an airplane or airport, there's never really anything good to eat. So I wanted to be able to source snacks that I could take with me on my trip. And so my wife would go to this cool place, get jerky, and we ended up making a company out of it. And my most difficult thing was actually trying to convey to people that the production cost of actually almost kind of minimally producing things was so much dramatically higher than things that were overly processed. Case in point, trying to do jerky that only has a few ingredients, that isn't packed with soy sauce, salt, and all these other key factors, like, actually like a good jerky that you don't feel like you have to drink a gallon of water out of, opposed from a Slim Jim where you don't even know what that is. And like people like that disconnect. And I remember going to not only different smokehouses, but actually going and visiting farms and seeing and talking to, producers of animals and being able to kind of go through this. And I remember being like, people have no concept of what it takes to go, farm to table. And because they have no concept, they have no kind of, global awareness of what the cost of these things are.
Sure. I could name, but I won't, some very popular and famous speakers who talk about their production systems, but it's always interesting to go talk to their neighbors because you kind of learn things. Most people aren't aware that, from the time that you put the bull in with the cows, it's going to be 9 months before a calf is born. And then that calf is going to be, and meanwhile, then you've got 3 months or so before that cow has to be rebred so that she'll give you a calf, the next year on time. And then that calf that was produced is going to take somewhere approaching 2 years before it's market ready. Or if it's a heifer and you've decided to keep her to, kind of add back to the cow herd, she's got to be bred, something like when she's 15 months, so that she'll have a calf at 24 months. And that during that phase, we can be running these animals on some, the cows can be run on some relatively unproductive ground. And in fact, because you're only going to get, that kind of, a cow only makes you money when you sell her or sell her calf, right? All the rest of her life, there's some expense to her. Now, your job as a rancher is to lower the inputs to the point where you can be making a profit, but you're not going to do that on the really highly productive, really expensive ground. You're always going to be out on that kind of rangeland or hill land that shouldn't be tilled, et cetera, et cetera. So getting people to understand that even that steer that, now has been raised until it's 800 pounds before it ever sees the feedlot, all that time was spent eating grass. And a lot of people don't know this. And again, some people don't know and, they're sincerely wrong, and other people do know and they're intentionally misleading people. We live in this culture where, as I said, I did go look up the numbers after I heard that one man give that quote, and the reality is that we have more people incarcerated, actually physically incarcerated, than we have primary operators of farms. And then you add on the number of people that are under probation or parole, and it gets much, much bigger. So there's a lot that you could say about those statistics, but the simplest thing is we're being very well fed by a very small number of people. And the communication between the producers and society at large has really broken down for a number of reasons. And part of the message ought to be is that no other time in human existence have we been able to get the foods that arguably we need for so little cost.
Have you ever heard someone claim that a steak was too good or that a chick was too hot? How about that an athlete was too fast? No, you haven't. Why? Because that would make no fucking sense at all. You know the slogan, speed is king and speed kills, but the value of being fast on the field is not limited to that of a catchy tagline. It is legitimately the defining characteristic of the better athlete when all else is considered equal. In fact, you can even mitigate your deficits in size, strength, and power by simply outrunning your opponent. This is why we've created the Power Athlete Speed Program, complete with instructional videos, points of performance, integrated speed tests, and progress tracking, thanks to Train Heroic. The fixed 8-week program is dedicated to increasing speed. Dial in your mechanics, increase efficiency, and seize the opportunity to optimize speed under duress. This is the best way to prepare yourself or your athletes to outrun the competition. Speed can be developed, expanded, and improved upon. No one athlete is truly fast or truly slow. Instead, they're either actively training for speed or they're riding the bench. Learn more about the new Power Athlete Speed program at www.powerathletehq.com. Now back to the show.
One of my examples, and I completely resonate with the troubles of eating right on the road. It's really amazing. But if it's really, really, I really have to have something, I can roll through one of the burger fast food chains and buy a breakfast sandwich. Now, one particular chain I know, if you get the bacon and egg muffin sandwich that they typically serve with cheese, but say no cheese, it becomes $1 a piece. And I just throw the muffin away and eat the contents. For $2, I can get a really good shot of animal fat and animal protein. That's remarkable. Is it ideal? No. But, this is something, a friend of mine, Adele Height, if you're not familiar with her and her blog, Ethropology, I really recommend her. We've done programs together, and there's some talks that have been posted. But she talks about working in a diabetes care clinic at Duke University Medical Center, and people who would literally go to the pizza joint buffet and scrape the toppings off the pizza, not eat the crust, eat that, and they improve their health. So,
I have twin girls, and we just had a little boy not too long ago, and my wife is real big on, we get up and make lunches, and a big thing in my household is not only do the kids help prepare, but I want them to see us cook so we don't eat out a lot. And a big part of hey, where does the meat come from? And this is the process. And they see mom and dad do this stuff, and they have to help and set the table. And it's just part of this thing where I just don't I want them to actually have a connection with the food and be I always show them pictures of the animals that I've taken, and they know that hey, this elk that we're eating, this is the one that Dad shot. And the thing which is most interesting is my wife makes lunches, and I do too, but whenever I go pick the kids up, I'm always amazed to see what parents are feeding their kids. So the other day I go and we had basically I put in the kids' lunches whatever we had that night. So we had a bunch of cubed elk that was I made a big stew in the crock. I put that in the girls' lunches and whatever else. But I show up and my kids are eating that with pomegranate seeds and this, and I look over and the 5 kids around them are eating pizza and cheese puffs. Mm-hmm. And I walk in, and these are 4-year-old little kids in preschool, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I'm wow, is this the state where I find it hard to believe that people in Newport Beach aren't somewhat educated. I mean, to live here, you got to be fairly educated and make some dough. So, here's people sending their kids off and, 4 years old with a slice of pizza and cheese puffs. And, that's a good meal for a 4-year-old. And it kind of always tripped me out. And I remember the teacher's oh, your kids' lunches look so good. I would eat them. And my comment is, you wouldn't eat any other kids' lunches? And the lady looked at me and shook her head. It's kind of if you think it's kind of a disconnect. I remember, I'm sure you've traveled extensively too. Anywhere you go in the world, and there's such a much higher value placed on food, and almost, you go to a foreign country, somebody invites you to your house for a meal. It's, it's bad taste to either decline and not eat everything. But here in America, it's the food cost is so little. I think, the average American spends, somewhere 10 to 15% of their total income a year on food, whereas in foreign countries, it's 30 and 40%. So it's just, I think there's just some serious disconnect, and maybe because it's, in a culture where we've just driven the price down, and when you drive the price down, either you have to, substitute that with either, filler or quality, and, or maybe it's mass production. But it just seems that, the production of food between the production and the consumer is broken. And I don't think people have an understanding of necessarily what the value of things are, or more importantly, what the cost to produce these things are.
Yeah, I think there's several things that we could talk about there, not the least of which is we've lost the practice of sitting down together and eating together. I remember visiting on a business trip Switzerland, and they had a McDonald's, for which I apologized, but their seating area was like 5 times the size that you would see in the U.S., and there were only a couple registers because it was understood that people weren't going to take the food and leave and eat it. They were going to eat it there. And your point about the client that comes in that's got all this labor-saving devices, but he's got no time to expend his labor in because he's busy doing all these other things. How much of our life today in the United States, and again, have to be careful, don't want to make sweeping generalizations about what everybody's life is like, but that idea that we're expending all this on convenience, but what do we do with the time that we're supposed to then achieve as a result of the convenience? So I think there's a number of things that we could look at there, not just the food system, and they all should be looked at. But, what did the first cell phones cost? And today they give them away, right? When I was a kid, I was at the tail end of when they tried to teach you how to use a slide rule. Yes, I'm that old. And then the rich kids started to get these $100+ calculators that would do math, multiplication, addition, division, and subtraction. And if they were really rich, their parents had bought them one that would do square roots, right? And yet today, they'll give away more powerful calculators than that. So all of these things have happened at clear across society. And it's right to look at impacts clear across society. But we do seem to, get back to the romance of things. We do seem to want to focus more on some aspects than others. I think that it is critical that people truly understand where food comes from and all of the costs of that production. And I'm more than happy to help people get in touch with, production agriculture. I think that that's really important. I had one of my achievements was to introduce Nina Teicholz, who wrote The Big Fat Surprise, to a woman named Ann Burkhalter. Now, both of those women come from urban backgrounds, right? They both went to college, and yet they end up in very different places. Anne happened to go to, I think, Dartmouth to be a collegiate swimmer, and there she met and later married a farm boy from Nebraska and ended up going back to Nebraska to raise their family. Well, she now runs a feed yard. Oh, that's an interesting perspective. And now you have Nina Teicholz, who gets, through her story, very into the whole big fat surprise, why butter, meat, and cheese belong in a healthy diet. So she gets really into the story of how we came to believe that saturated fat is harmful, but she has no ag background. Anne, meet Nina. Nina, meet Anne. Talk to each other. You're both raising families. You have this background in common. Go for it. And, oh, by the way, Anne wasn't aware of Nina's book. So, yeah, read this because you're raising the product that's been demonized for the last 40 years. And she's doing it with integrity. She's doing it with outside monitoring. She's constant improvement. All these things that are going on in the beef industry that people just aren't aware of. And so we need to, I think, do a better job of communicating. And unfortunately, there's just a whole lot of talking at people these days. You may have noticed that.
Well, you keep talking about this, shift, and for those of you guys listening, really that shift, if you go back and, kind of pick its roots, it's kind of that Ansel Keys, the 7-country study, and the idea that there was a correlation between, heart disease and saturated fat, and ironically, about a week later, it got disproved, but it didn't seem that anybody wanted to listen. And, and now we've gone down this, over 40 years. You're talking almost 50 plus years of this idea that, there's a problem. And even to this day, I still hear people be like, this and, fat. And I'm like, dude, there's no correlation between dietary cholesterol and the cholesterol in your body and fat. And it seems to be that even though we know that, these two are not related, people will not give it up. And I have no idea why it's so hard. Was it ingrained? Better idea, did we build an entire industry around it? Or was it, some form of clandestine deal to try to, I don't know. It seems to me that I've been talking to people about this so long that I'm at the point now where I just don't even talk to them about it anymore. I'm like, dude, if I'm not going to convince you, and all I'm doing is wasting my time, but, here's the opportunity to go and learn something.
Well, we do know, there's now papers that came out, last September, that estimated that over half of the adult population of America is either diabetic or pre-diabetic. We also have some reason to expect from some other work that it may be as high as 75% or more of adults are somewhere along that spectrum of prediabetes, metabolic syndrome, hyperinsulinemia, and then overt diabetes, somewhere along that, up more than 75%. So, as in my case, when I started to notice, abdominal obesity, elevated blood pressure, depressed HDL cholesterol, elevated triglycerides, elevated fasting blood glucose, by the technical definition, if you've got 3 out of those 5, you've got metabolic syndrome. So let's forget about what everyone should be eating, and let's just focus on 75% of the population that could be somewhere in that camp. And what could be said is that the first thing someone in that situation ought to be doing is eating a diet restricted in carbohydrate and therefore high in fat. And the fats that they ought to be eating ought to be those coming from animal products or olive oil, coconut oil, avocado oil, not seed oils. That's it. And if we, what are the metrics that you use with your clients to indicate that they're making progress? Well, up until recently, we haven't had really good metrics to look or to measure against in the population because we've been so confused. But we're getting much better metrics now that people can actually see real improvement in their health and lowering of their risk of any number of chronic diseases. And the list is pretty scary. We can look at heart disease, kidney disease, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, all of these, diabetes, all of these are now understood to share some common linkage. But we also live in a society where the third leading cause of premature death is treatment or examination. Iatrogenic is the name for the caused by treatment or examination, the third leading cause of premature death, and the rate of injury is estimated to be 10 to 20-fold greater. So it could be argued that if you really wanted to improve the health of Americans, you should restrict access to the medical care system. But what really can be said is the best thing you can do for your health is stay out of the hospital. What we do really well in this country is treat the acute, injury. What we're not so good at is treating the chronic illness. So it becomes hard to have conversations about specific small pieces when there's a much bigger picture that people at least need to be aware of, so that when somebody starts saying, I eat a vegetarian diet because I don't want to kill animals, and that's the diet that we used to eat, well, that's factually incorrect on both cases. But how are you going to have that conversation? Better, I think, to reach people at that point of crisis like I was when in 2007 I realized that something needed to change. And fortunately, my wife had been on this journey for 5 years before that. But she's a very smart woman, and she knew that talking to me about it before I was ready to listen to her talk to me about it probably wouldn't be helpful. So her approach was, this is what I'm going to eat. What would you like to eat? One of accommodation while stating what it was that she was going to do. And then, finally, I became ready. And fortunately, I had an in-house expert that I could lean on for guidance, at least to get me introduced to books and websites and such. And it's been an interesting journey ever since.
We, from our perspective, I see this thing in a kind of a performance model, and, in terms of, being able to not only, recover, being able to do your job bigger, stronger, faster. And, there's no question that eating, I guess you could say, a diet of, kind of an animal-based protein, real food diet is, going to produce much greater, not only strength, recovery, performance gains than eating, more conventional, or I guess you say more westernized or just more, mainstream type diet. And, and then what happens is we get things like, for example, there was some article that forwarded me the other day where a guy, coming back from his ACL reconstruction, all of a sudden, is recovering like Wolverine. And, that was the comment they made. And the idea is that he has, tired of eating toxins and poison, so he's gone vegan, and now he's healing. And, the problem is one, I know that's complete bullshit, but if you're eating a diet of, chicken McNuggets, fast food, and more, Cheetos and pizza, and then all of a sudden you move to eating more like a vegan diet where he's eating obviously, not those foods, but maybe something more healthy in terms of what a vegan would view as healthy. Obviously you're going to have, a gain over it. So what's hard for us and what we constantly fight is things like this. And it's like, vegan. And I'm like, it doesn't make sense. And the problem that I have is that there's so much supporting information. If you go read the T. Colin Campbell deal with, the China study and then, versus, Dr. Cordain, and, you go through and you see how they cherry picked all the data, and it's been beat to death, so we don't need to get into it. But what's amazing is people are so willing to cling to these things. It's, and the only explanation I have is that food has become almost the new religion, where, they talk about, you go to a cocktail party, you don't talk about politics or religion. Well, you go to you meet people, and the one thing you almost want to avoid is talking about food. And, and really, what is healthy has become such a confusing space that, it's almost so difficult to tackle it, because everybody's vision and view of healthy is different. What is healthy? And the way I look at healthy is, like you said, if you go get your blood work done and you have metabolic derangement, whatever you were doing is not working. But oddly enough, people are going to ride this stuff to the bottom of the ocean. And we have obesity problems, but yet, people are thinking to themselves, well, I'm fat. The fat on my waist must equal the fat I'm eating, so I'm going to eat a low-fat diet, and that's going to work for me. And it just doesn't make sense that way. And, It just, I don't understand. I mean, maybe it's, lack of education, maybe it's a vested interest, but it just seems that this paradigm shift is not happening. Even though it is happening, people aren't hearing the message.
I guess maybe I choose to be an optimist, but there were a couple points, and I'd like to kind of cycle back. One is, the teacher's comment that she wouldn't eat that way, yet I wonder how what she's teaching is constrained by the policy that tells us what is healthy. Right, the food policy in the United States is, actually a lot of policy in the United States is incredibly tied to the dietary guidelines. And so that's one reason why that needs to be dealt with. Number two, your point about we can now discuss food. That's, so what's the joke about if you're a vegan that does CrossFit, which do you tell people first? Because that seems to now be this method of virtue signaling. That's a concept of, rather than us actually do the hard work of developing virtue, in the Latin word strength, we'll support causes that show that we're good, or we'll buy the right things that shows that we're good, rather than actually go do anything about it. Sure. Adele has a comment that Americans love the idea of saving the world by shopping, and so buying the right food is part of this picture as well. I've had the very rewarding experience of having a number of people come up to me. I've been out talking in this country and others about this for over 5 years now. And I have people that come up and they say, whatever it is they say about their own personal journey. Now, when I'm in my right mind, what I say is, I'm just a pipe for this information. I didn't do the research. I didn't, write the book. I'm just repeating to you information that other people have given me. And they then went and applied the information and had the completely predictable results. It's not even hard, it's just like, yeah, you'll do it. And so they come back and they say something very kind, and I then say, I'm so happy for you. Well, I think that this revolution, at one point, I wanted to call, this grassroots health, but that title was already taken by people who were doing work with vitamin D, so I couldn't use that. So grass-based health is what I started writing about. And again, back to the very beginning of when we spoke, I was very, supportive, and I still am, with qualification for grass-fed meats and dairy. It's not that I'm saying don't, but I've kept the name because I need to maintain that honesty to say, yeah, I was once sort of over the tips of my skis a little bit and had to come back, but also because ruminant agriculture is grass-based. In fact, all of animal agriculture in the United States is grass-based. If I can find the figures, it's something like, I've got some figures here that show that if you look at all the feed that goes into feeding all of the animals in the United States, not pets, but food animals, you're looking at almost 2/3 of that feed is forage. And that includes poultry that get no forage. And that includes swine that get only, they get 15-20%. So the livestock industry in the United States is a forage-based industry. And again, not a lot of people know that. And I'm a forage geek, so I guess I shouldn't expect people to know that. But again, the conversation has been so tainted by these other narratives and conflated. Francis Moore Lepay, Diet for a Small Planet, is a book that came out in the early 70s. And of course, that was the spirit of the time, right? And that book really influenced the staff members of George McGovern's committee that ended up writing the dietary goals in the first place. And there are fundamental problems with her nutritional information, but there's also fundamental problems with her whole message, which was that the earth can't support this number of people if we eat meat. That's not true. And so how do we get those messages out?
Well, it sounds like the only way we're going to support it is by eating animal products. I mean, obviously, in terms of nutritional density, they're much higher. But, I mean, just to really go back, I mean, it seems as if the grass-fed versus grain-fed, it seems to be kind of it doesn't seem, but it is really kind of overblown in a lot of ways where, if an animal is raised, it takes, 12 to 14, 18 months to raise, an animal to full maturity, and send it off. I mean, if at the last, 30 days of its life, it's actually fattened up on grain. I mean, it seems to be pretty negligible. And when it seems as if most of the animals that would be classified as a grain-fed animal are raised on, some form of forage. And that's an accurate statement?
Yeah, the majority, if I found the slide now, if I just look at all of the beef cattle in the United States, just the beef cows, not the dairy cows, a little bit more than 80% of the feed that's used to feed all of the beef cattle in the United States is forage. That comes in when you take an animal and you put it into a feed yard for, as you say, those last 4 months or so. And at that point, they're still going to get 25 to 30% of their ration is going to be forage. And then the thing you got to be careful about is that other 70 to 75% of their ration is called concentrate, and that's a bit antique, but it's something that we're still dealing with in animal nutrition. A concentrate is a feedstuff that has a relatively high level of energy in it. Well, that can be something like vegetable processing waste. Right? So you go out in the field and you harvest, let's say, potatoes. Okay, and then you take those potatoes and you run them through a plant that makes French fries or potato chips or God knows what. That's going to produce potato peelings, cull potatoes, etc. Well, that's a waste product from the human food perspective, but that all goes into feed yards in the area to feed animals, which can then turn it into human utilizable food. And the same thing happens even with grains that could be fed to humans, but because they're off grade or in some sense not, marketable directly for human consumption, they can then go off and be fed to ruminant livestock. And one of the things that happens as a result is the human food is cheaper because they don't have to pay to dispose of that waste stream, right? So again, it's an interlocking system. And again, when people talk about grain versus grass, they're kind of oversimplifying just a little bit, understandably so, but the reality is a little different from what the popular conversation is.
So, Peter, before, and John, both you guys, I guess, because I was one of these guys before I came out here, right? Before I was enlightened by getting to meet you and everybody, John, that you're involved with. But, people are going to listen to this, and they're going to shit their pants. And they're going to be like, who do I do that? I have so many unanswered questions. So in terms of someone who's going to be eating beef or going to the market to grab beef, I mean, what is the decision matrix you have to, like, what do you have to take into consideration? What are the cascading, like, okay, yeah, absolutely, eat your grass-fed beef, but understand here's the basis why you should be eating grass-fed versus maybe just the grain-fed variety. Like, what information can we arm people with to extinguish their concerns that are surely to arise? Because we've been big proponents of grass-fed.
The one thing that I will say is kind of, a big turnoff for me is the idea that animals, or else the big one, and you could answer this 100% better than I can, the idea that animals that are not raised on a more, forage diet tend to have more health problems. So then there's also a deal with antibiotics. So I remember there was this huge push in terms of, having to provide antibiotics to these different animals. So then therefore the meat was, higher antibiotic content. I mean, that was another one we were hearing a lot about that I don't really
let's just squash that one real quickly. There is testing for antibiotic residues in milk and in meat, and it is a non-issue, right? So that, buying local in some senses gets outside of the monitoring process. So if you're really wanting to avoid antibiotic residue in meat, and I'm not saying it's an issue in local, right? I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is when it goes through local processing, it then is outside of the commercial. And the commercial processing stream involves routine testing for antibiotic residue.
All right. So the antibiotics is out. So that's bullshit because, there was like what was it, Cowspiracy and all this bullshit where they're showing, them basically forklifting dead animals and throwing them into the meat grinders.
Right. Male bovine fecal matter. Yeah.
So the antibiotics is kind of bullshit. The other one is that there's, people love, it's really what our country has turned into, this idea of fear-mongering where people rather get their nutrition and political perspective based off of a forward chain letter, it seems like, than actually doing anything by talking to experts. And really, we were talking about offline. Part of the deal with this company is power up. They battle the bullshit. And the problem becomes, we're not necessarily wed to anything other than performance and empowering your performance. So, in terms of weight training, if bouncing on a Butsu ball with a candle above your head produced the most performance gains for field sports and what we're looking to do, we would have that in the program. It's kind of similar to food. I know that eating a, real food diet produces greater, not only strength, muscle, and performance gains than eating something that, has, overly processed. But, when we really get stuck into this idea is, people ask me, they're like, the grass-fed versus grain-fed debate. I'm like, at the end of the day, as long as you're eating meat, I'd say, protein, you're ahead of the game. Now, if, there is some, and I admit I fall prey to this too. If there's, personally, I kind of like the taste of game and grass-fed meat a little bit better than, commercially kind of stuff. And I notice the taste and the consistency. It also cooks a lot faster, so you have to kind of undercook it a little bit, which I do too. So, but realistically, it doesn't sound like a lot of the boogeymen that I guess the primal paleo community's been making it out to be is really there.
Kind of from the beginning of our talk, I think so many issues have been raised around a similar narrative. And basically, the idea is that, meat is bad. Well, this kind of meat is less bad. Right. And so you can feel better because you're going to eat meat. Humans are going to do that. But, you want to eat the right kind of meat, and so I understand all of that. I would, there's a couple things, sort of thought experiments. If you were engaged in the production of beef and you weren't convinced of its safety, would you feed it to your family? Second thought experiment. We know that stress is harmful for human beings, right? In any number of ways. Would it be a stretch to imagine that that same kind of stressful condition would hurt animal performance?
Yeah.
And so if your livelihood is involved in the production or the efficient production of animal products that you then sell, and understand the very tight margins that a lot of these businesses are on, you would be very interested in reducing stress because that would improve performance. And also you would be interested in lowering your input costs as much as reasonable. And those two things are often tied. So if you have mismanagement of some kind, you're more likely to have animals that get sick, therefore have to be treated. And so everything that you do is geared towards lowering stress, improving herd health, reducing, therefore, the need for inputs. So in some ways, a lot of the arguments are they're illogical once you can step back and look at what it is these people are trying to do. Now, I have to be real careful with this one, but some people have made this case that any nursing mother knows the impact of stress on lactation. Well, might it be a similar situation in a dairy? Yeah, it is. The same situation. And in fact, Peter Defty that I mentioned earlier, who's done Vespa, I think is his company working with ultra endurance athletes, made the case about just what athletes the modern dairy cow is and what she's able to do in terms of the production of milk. So again, there are many ways to look at this, and I'm really grateful to have the situation that I'm in to try to foster the conversation. You mentioned, or it was mentioned, I think Luke mentioned, you're going to have people that just kind of twitch real hard. And I understand that. We can't get people all the way from one position to another because they listen to what the hell is that guy called? An agronomist? What does he know? And absolutely. There are talks that I've given that are online. You can find stuff that I'm writing where I'm just trying to point to other people and say, go check this out.
Well, Doc, you're not to you don't have to, no self-deprecating, but you are the expert that we contacted on this for that good reason. It's similar to when, I hear somebody talking about, training to play in the NFL or NFL players do this, and I'm like, that's fucking bullshit. That isn't at all what happens. And more importantly, like, I'm going to offer some stuff or some information based off of my experiences, what I've done and what I've seen work. And we've been fortunate to teach hundreds of seminars all over the globe teaching, this method that, I put together and, from the Arctic Circle down all the way to New Zealand and back. And so, these, ideas is that, to really have good information, you have to get outside of your circle and start, or really enlarge your circle and have conversations with people that are, that are doing something completely different than what you were doing, so that the information that you bring back is probably the freshest, least tainted, and more importantly, the most objective information you can provide. So somebody that's actually, working in this field that is saying, and that was what I enjoyed about your talk, where you were like, if it's fatty acid profile, then don't eat any almonds or don't eat any walnuts because, a handful of walnuts is going to have way more omega-6 than any type of, grain-fed meat. So, and that's something that we hear so much. I mean, that was the email that I got, or that question that I got was, I only have, $100 a month to spend on food. Is, how can I eat this organic grass-fed deal? And I was like, one, you physically or, budget-wise, you can't. And, at the end of the day, the most important thing is that you're actually consuming, animal-based protein. So this is, the best way to do it. And the way that I offered him was chicken thighs and organ meats, because, surprisingly in this country, organ meats are, some of the, cheapest meats out there because people don't want to eat them, whereas in other countries they're some of the most expensive. So it's refreshing to hear. And, so much what we run into is this people holding the dogma on the party line because it most benefits them, and you run into somebody that's objective, and that's why, the information's so good.
I encourage people to shop with confidence, but look at what you're buying, right? So there was that thing about shop the outside of the market, but you can find, potatoes on the outside of the market. And, if you're somewhere in that metabolic syndrome continuum, you probably need to be careful with the white potatoes. But I appreciate what you say, and I encourage people to look deeper into the information, to find, and even Gary Taubes in his book Why We Get Fat, and I've cited this a couple times. He very correctly sidesteps some of these questions that people come back. What aboutism or something? What about thisism? Is the argument that always comes back is, yeah, but what about this? Yeah, but what about that? No. Let's stay here and have this conversation, because if what he's now talking about in the book that apparently is going to come out the end of December, there was just a video released of one of his early talks. He just gave it a couple months ago. It's likely that cancer is more related to chronically elevated insulin than it is about toxins in the diet. So now let's talk about why you would buy organic, right? And I've got pictures of the organic toaster pastry. What is it? Or the mac and cheese in a box from grass-fed cows? Really? What's that going to do for you? What is it you think you're buying with that label claim? I'm not saying for a moment it doesn't meet the label claim. I'm saying, what is it you think you're achieving by paying more for that product?
To it, I did have a question. If it's relevant, if you ever change your appeals, because you spoke at the Ancestral Symposium, and most of the audience has bought into kind of your research. But you change anything when you're working with or introducing this info to kind of a new audience, if you will?
Well, I guess on the ag audiences, I end up talking more about the dietary message. Which, some people might find, sort of like playing t-ball, right? Yeah, you're going to go talk to the beef industry about eating beef. That must be tough. But a lot of the people haven't heard the information that, John would be talking to people about, or that, maybe the people there, certainly the people in the paleo or primal community are more familiar with. And so you look at these audiences and you see a lot of people that, at least in my mind, qualify for, metabolic syndrome diagnosis. And, they're small businessmen. They've got to worry about healthcare. So there are those implications beyond just the products, and I also have this dream that one of these days I'm going to run into the right cattleman that's politically connected, who's going to start rattling some cages. So that's part of it as well. But, mostly it has, the talk really doesn't change that much. What's happened now is I have multiple talks. So, meat is medicine is one, red meat is green is another, which, was my attempt to start talking about environmental issues. And now what I'm developing is this concept of a ruminant revolution. That the only way that we're going to feed 9 billion people by 2050 is by improving ruminant agriculture. And by doing that, we'll improve the environment. And by doing that, we'll improve the health of people, not just in this country, but I mean, diabetes is a worldwide epidemic. And if we're right, we're going to have to do a lot more than just 60% more animal products, because all those estimates are based on the same, what's a healthy diet paradigm. So, and then that, that talk allows you to talk about things like what really happens with grassland agriculture in terms of carbon sequestration, wherever we are with that whole question, or environmental impact from ruminant agriculture versus conventional, cropping, cash crop, row crop agriculture. And there are a number of things that we can address under that, not the least of which is back in the 60s and 70s, Professor Borlaug helped like a billion people avoid starvation. That's a worthy goal. But now the ruminant revolution will be about prosperity, not just survival. So that's how it changes a little bit.
Peter, when you talk about the ruminant revolution, is there anything like any radical changes in technology or agriculture that people are looking into? Like, maybe lunar agriculture or something like that? We're going to ship some cows to the moon?
Think about a rumen in zero gravity, and that's not a real appealing thought.
Or an enclosed room with methane gas parts. I mean.
Yeah. I think that there is room for technology, and I've talked about that a bit. The company that I work for is a grass breeding and seed production company, and then we wholesale market throughout the world, export throughout the world, wholesale market throughout U.S. We also export to other countries like Canada and Mexico, but we're part of a worldwide company. We have developed varieties of grasses just through standard selection and screening process that are more digestible than the vast majority of the same species of that grass that are used today. So in other words, if people could be growing grass that's more digestible, has more energy. We can do a better job of feeding high-producing ruminants with these grasses so they need less grain, which is a good thing. There's some work about how you can feed animals at weaning that then sets them up for the remainder of their life to have more desirable carcass traits. And so, briefly stated, I could take an animal at weaning for 3 months and feed them versus taking that animal through to the final phase and put them in a feedlot for weaning for 3 months. And if I'm feeding them at 4% of live weight at both times, I end up feeding them less early because they weigh less. But I end up with a better product at the end, even though they've been on grass for the rest of their lives. Very interesting stuff. There's interesting stuff with fetal implanting, imprinting. There's implanting as well, but that's different. So that the nutrition of the cow affects how well that calf is going to perform. And you could apply this to humans as well, and it gets really scary. Some of the stuff Taubes was talking about, like infants born to diabetic mothers are at a 45 times greater risk of being diabetic by age 25 than children born to non-diabetic mothers. And if they're just insulin resistant or high glucose, like gestational diabetes, the children are 20 times greater risk. So that's a bit of the tsunami that's coming at us. Back to the technology. There's a whole bunch of portable fencing and temporary water supply systems that farmers can now use so they can get greater control of animals on the pastures, which helps with a number of areas. There's some things with fertilizer, there's some things with natural pest control or resistance. So there's a whole number of things, including just remote sensing. People have actually developed tools so that farmers can very quickly estimate how much dry feed they have on their various pastures so that they can then go back and say, okay, how many days can I graze these animals here before I have to move them, And so they can look down and say, in a month's time, I'm going to be short or long on feed, so I need to make management decisions now so that I don't get stuck in a train wreck then. So there's a whole bunch of that sort of technology and knowledge and skill, and that's just in this country. You start going overseas, where a lot of this is going to have to take place, obviously. And there's just that and everything we've learned for the last 40, 50, 60 years that could be applied to help them. But of course, a lot of that also involves politics and ownership and those, sort of things as well. But the potential is undeniably there.
Wow. So with a lot of this, would you call it genetic modification of the grass seed and things like that? Are we tiptoeing on kind of the Monsanto conspiracy now?
Not at all. Not at all. No, we don't have to go there in this realm. Everything that we're doing, again, in the company that I work for is non-GMO in that sense, right? It is strictly. We go out, these grasses that we use in North America, most of them originated somewhere else. So they came here as part of the Columbian Exchange. And so we have people that go to the areas, the parts of the world, Mediterranean region, North Africa, Southern Europe, Middle Europe, and we make collections of these species that are growing out there where they've grown for millennia. And then we bring those animals, we bring those plants in to the greenhouse and we separate them out, and then we plant them in space plantings, single grass plants, so that we can see how they perform. Do they survive, first of all? Do they yield seed here in Oregon? Second of all, if we find something that looks promising, then we send it out to, say, Missouri or Alabama or Georgia or Virginia, somewhere out in the marketplace, and see how do they survive there? Do they yield forage, et cetera, et cetera? If they work there, then we bring them back and we do some more selections to make sure that we're looking at something that will still be a viable seed crop. And then once we get enough seed put together, then we send it back out and we say, okay, here's enough to plant bigger plots, either for cutting trials or even bigger plots so that you can put animals on them. And we go through that process, and this can take a decade or more. But ultimately, we end up with plants that are well adapted, that are productive, that are, because we select them for things like greater digestibility, which is a genetic trait, then we end up with something that the farmer can grow and end up producing more digestible fiber on a unit of land than he could before.
So there's, I guess it's what you're saying is that there's more nutritious grass, or just there's better grasses that are more adapted, or are the animals more adapted as?
You need grass-fed grass.
Good grass, bad grass. Yeah, exactly right. No, that's exactly right. Spot on. I'll have to give you credit for that one.
Somewhere, we're looking for grass-fed grass.
Somewhere I came across the idea of, if you hear something you like, the first 3 times you repeat it, you give the guy credit. After that, it's yours.
Yeah, that's funny. It seems like such a paradigm in that, there was this, and I want to say right around 2008, 2009, when really paleo and the primal deal kind of blew up, and it was just kind of harking back to a simpler time, and this is how, things, and the Joel Saladins of the world, and, this is how, animals were raised for millennium, and, this is how it should be, and that, a lot of the health problems we're having today come from this. And, my argument was always like, well, my great-grandparents were farmers, and they ate a diet probably pretty similar to what you're talking about, but they also got up at 4 a.m. and they worked nonstop, having to, without the use of modern machinery, to not only, raise the animals, tend them, do everything, and, drank coffee black and this whole deal, and lived to be in their 80s, much healthier. And people are like, oh, it was the lifestyle. I'm like, oh, it was the fact that these people got up and worked their ass off 7 days a week in the sun, and out of necessity, and survived. And it's like, I almost think that as human beings, that, the more comfort and least stress that we remove from our lives almost, probably hurts us more than anything. Sitting in a confines of an office behind a computer all day is probably more detrimental to, your health than are you consuming organic foods. So, but the problem is it's easier to make those fights, being like, well, like you said, it's the trade-off. Like, well, I'm sitting in an office and I'm not really doing much all day in terms of, exercise, but I'm eating organic, so I'm doing something. So it's kind of like offering people, small victories, I guess you could say, in a lot of ways, is that, hey, I'm doing this because I can't do this, and so it's become more acceptable. And I love when people ask me those questions. I'm like, well, dude, and I tell them the story about my great grandparents, and I'm like, dude, but they literally worked. My grandmother or great grandmother got up, and not only the food that they prepared, but they that they grew, went in, and she spent the entire day in the kitchen, because you had to make everything from scratch. And the minute breakfast got done, they made lunch and they made dinner, and that's how it was spent. And it's like, how many hours a day are people spending in the kitchen really making their food? No, they're not. So, like you said, it's become a matter of convenience, and I think people look and they point at these things, not seeing the bigger picture.
Well, there's a quote here: the risks that kill people and the risks that concern people are completely different.
Yeah.
And if we, in some cases, this is sort of this imposed guilt. We've been told what we need to do to be healthy, that is lean and healthy. And if we're not lean and healthy, we must not be doing it right. Now, to some extent, maybe we aren't doing it, but maybe we are. And so then you have that sort of compounded guilt thing. And so if there's something that will help me feel a little better, then maybe that's, maybe that's worth paying more for. I don't know. What's the impact of that on your physical health? I think it's absolutely true that we, I talked to the 80-year-old ranchers who remember their 90-year-old grandparents. So that puts it back a while. They're talking about them with, frying the eggs, swimming in bacon grease for breakfast. And, damn if it didn't kill them when they were 95. We clear something. There's a genetic component, undeniably. There's also an environmental component, undeniably. What is that environmental component? And unfortunately, people are so geared to look for patterns and even see patterns that don't exist. And then once they've seen patterns, continue to see them, even though they've been refuted. The question of taste is one that comes up a lot. And the science of taste and discernment is really fascinating to look at. If you, and I think I got this from the book Blink, but the people that do rigorous taste testings know that you can skew the results unintentionally or intentionally with a lot of factors beyond the taste itself. So the best example is, in this country, if you like have a cylindrical container for ice cream, and you fill it up from the mix. And then the very next container that you fill up from the very same mix is, one of those block containers, and you put them both in the same freezer, and then you bring them out for the taste test. If you don't let the tasters see the package, so you truly blind, you just give them a dish of each, they won't be able to tell a difference because there isn't one. If, on the other hand, you let them see the package, in the United States, they will reliably pick the ice cream from the cylindrical container as tasting better, because we've been conditioned to associate that cylindrical container with premium ice cream. And if you switch them up so that you let them believe that the ice cream that they're tasting came from the cylindrical container when in fact it came from the other one, they'll say it tastes better than the.
Well, okay, like in terms of meat, and I cook. We pretty much barbecue or cook steaks. Almost for majority, almost every single. I've eaten red meat or at least some form of meat almost every meal. When I got off, we'll have to eat chicken. I feel like I want to eat dirt, but I will definitely say that the grass-fed meat cooks dramatically faster.
Oh yeah.
For me, it just and my wife is I like it pretty much as just like black and blue, heat it up and put it on the plate. Whereas my wife likes it a little bit more. So I refuse to cook any steak past medium rare. And so what she'll do is she'll take it, and the other day with the elk, she's like, "Oh, it's too bloody." I'm like, "Do it yourself." So she'll throw it in the oven for a few, and she was in there for 3 minutes and it overcooked like that. She's like, "I've never seen anything overcooked like that." And I'm like, "It's got to be fat content." Obviously that's a leaner, grazing wild animal's obviously going to be a little bit leaner than, especially in drought here in California, than something else. But that's something where, if you gave me 2 steaks, I could tell you which was grass fed pretty much by the taste and also how fast it cooks.
Oh, absolutely. The point was not to say that there isn't, in fact, a taste difference, but it is to say that a lot of the conversation might be colored by people being very committed to one side or the other, right? And maybe it would be more appropriate with organic vegetables or fruits or something like that. No, without a doubt, there are qualitative differences to the meat from 2 different production systems. I just remembered one of the comments, and I haven't had a chance to look at it much, but if I remember right, and this is all, again, coming from Dr. Michael Eads, if you look at hunter-gatherers, they tended to eat, the hunters tended to eat the organ meat. They tended to go after the brain, and they tended to go after marrow and things like that. The muscle meat was either left or it was what they used to dry for later use, things like that, or they'd haul a haunch back to wherever. He made a comment at some point, I forget exactly when, perhaps what we've done in our animal husbandry, the selection and breeding and feeding practices of modern animal agriculture, is produce more fattier meat from these animals than was previously available. And so now we have cattle, for example, that can have a higher fat content in muscle meat than the wild oryx would have, or that earlier, longhorn type animals would have. And that's, again, something for us to kind of look into and think about just a little bit. Whereas, there's been all this pressure over the years to lower the fat content of meat, so much so that the pork industry actually went overboard and produced really long, really lean pigs that produced very lean pork that ended up being basically tasteless. And so then, they have to do various things in processing, or people lose interest, and then they discover things like some of the older breeds of pork that are produced, as you say, from local producers. They're actually now trying to produce pork with a little bit more fat content. But one of the things that happened, go ahead.
Last year I took 2 pretty big pigs hunting. I mean, they were well over 350 pounds apiece. And I put all that in the freezer, and I remember Luke came over, and we had what we called a porkalypse. And, we made, what was it? It was ribs. Literally I probably cooked easily 40 or 50 pounds of, I had the big green egg, the barbecue. We invited everybody over to have this porkalypse. And the comment was made repeatedly, I didn't know pork could taste this good. And I was like, really? And they were like, usually pork has just got such a bland taste, but this is actually like probably the best stuff. To the point where even my wife, who doesn't like pork, actually ate it and was like, wow, this is really good. I would eat this. And I wasn't sure if it was the taste or the fact that it was, that I, harvested these things myself. And I tell people that when I came up on these pigs, they were literally had eaten themselves sick in an alfalfa field up in Central California, or in, middle of California. They were literally they were just decimating these alfalfa fields, and that's where I got them. And I'm like, dude, these things were fat on alfalfa, which to me is a pretty good diet for pigs. So that was but I definitely agree with you on that one. But I remember Lauren Cordain showing me a picture that was taken by right around in the 1800s, was taken a picture by some buffalo hunters that had gone out and hunted with some local Indians, and the picture showed the Indians sitting there. And I remember they were standing in front of these big bulls, and their guts were so distended and their faces were covered in blood. And on the back of the picture, I guess the guy had made the point that each of the Indians had eaten something like 8 pounds of organ meat. That as soon as they shot the animal, they went right in and actually started taking out the different organs, and they basically gored themselves on the organs. And then they took this picture, and you could see these dudes, whole face covered in blood with these massive distended guts. And that was the part that they were really going after first. So, whereas, you can't give away organ meats anymore in this country. And that was kind of the gist of that write-up, where I'm like, dude, you got to go search out the organ meats. They're the best bang for buck. It's a nutritional kind of a hot spot, and you can get that stuff pretty cheap. So.
Well, Peter, we ran actually pretty long, a solid conversation.
Yeah.
You're a wealth of knowledge. For the folks listening to this, one piece of advice.
I'm kind of a little nervous that you're going to get bombarded with questions and fear mongering and people being like, oh my God, this isn't as bad. So I'm just telling you to.
But the first step, I guess, if people want to learn a little bit more about what you got going on, where should they go? Is there a web property that you want to push out there? Is it your social media? What's up?
Yeah, right now I'm most active in social media. I have a blog that really has a lot of cobwebs on it and needs to be dusted off. So you can find me on Twitter under Grassfeed as one word. And by name. You can find me on Facebook. I have a grass-based health page. Again, you can find some videos of presentations both on YouTube and Vimeo. I would also encourage people to become really familiar with the information that's presented in books like Why We Get Fat and What to Do About It, The Big Fat Surprise, Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. I think, Finney and Volek, their Art and Science of a Low Carbohydrate Diet is really useful. And then there's a number of other books that I just find very, very, very interesting. If anyone's interested in things like the history of the Americas pre and post Columbus, Charles C. Mann, M-A-N-N, wrote 2 books, 1491 and 1493. And it's one of those opportunities to just kind of crack open a lot of these other narratives that we've been given, and maybe like with the diet, I think that if we can get people to understand that what they've been told is a healthy diet isn't, then that might help us, or at least start the process of opening people up to some of these other conversations, and understand.
A lot of our listeners are probably pretty far down that process. I guess, do you have any resources where we could poke around the facts and dispel a lot of the myths about agriculture and the grain-fed conspiracy or misconceptions?
Well, yeah, let's call it a misconception, to be charitable. I think that, not to be too self-serving, the talks that I've given, the things that I post, all have references so people can go to those references and look them up. I've been challenged by some former major professors that I need to be writing a book. So that's in process. I'll be speaking at the low carbohydrate conference in San Diego, the end of July. I'll be giving a poster at Ancestral Health in August.
Oh, great. Well, I'll tell you what, when that book comes out, Peter, hit us back up and we'll get you back on and we can see where that journey has taken you and, talk about that big milestone in your career.
Wonderful. And between now and then, feel free to reach out and contact me with specific issues or questions, or I'd be happy to talk some more. As you can tell, I do go on a bit.
It's great.
All of us do. But hey, thanks a lot for jumping on and helping us out. And we'll definitely be on social media and hit you up in any way. And we really appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome. Thanks for the opportunity, and good luck with your work.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Now it's time for you to empower your performance. No doubt we'll get some interesting comments in response to our conversation with Dr. Peter Ballerstedt. We encourage all of Power Athlete Nation to dive balls deep into their own research, starting with Peter's blog, grassbasedhealth.blogspot.com, or you can find him on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, all under the name Grass-Based. Until next time, bye!